Welcome to Bamfordrose and it's question of the week. In this week's question of the week, it is rear subframes. So this is the tubular steel subframe on your DB9 or Aston Martin V8 Vantage, and if you need to think about refurbishing it. So stay tuned and we'll talk about Aston and subframes. So I've just had a look in our workshop this morning. We've got about 12 cars inside currently being worked on, and of those 12 I've just counted up 5 that have got refurbished subframes. So as owners know, this is starting to creep in as quite a bit of an issue. The classic 2000 Vanquish has always been renowned for having to be careful on looking at the front subframe at point of purchase and checking that you don't need a refurb. This is because the front subframe on that car is steel sectioned, as is the tubular rear subframe. But on the DB9 and the modern V8 Vantage, you've got extruded aluminium front subframe, you've got bonded aluminium chassis, and pretty much the only thing to worry about on corrosion is your tubular steel rear subframe. That's why an anti-corrosion check and a stamp in the book on those cars was pretty pointless really, because it didn't really cover many components, if any, apart from that steel rear subframe. Now, one of those 12 cars that I just mentioned earlier was a car that's in from France for upgrade. Now, this is an 06 V8 Vantage and it's got about 30,000 miles on. Now, the owner has used this. It's not been hidden away just on dry days. It's been used wet in France. I don't know if it's been taken out in the winter, but even just for a car that's been used in the wet, not in winter, no salt on the road, then the underside is in really good condition. The subframe is perfect, even though it's 06, it's nowhere near close to being needing a refurb. And if you look at the geometry adjusters, a load of other fixing, brake lines, there's just no level of corrosion on the car to the extent that you see on UK cars. Now, we've worked on cars in Spain, Germany, America, even Canada, and not seen the level of corrosion that you see on UK cars. Now, I don't know what's going on in the UK, where there's something in the water, something in the salt, but something is absolutely chewing their way through these cars. And tubular rear subframe, the hard lines of the brake pipes, so this is the caliper's got a soft line, the soft line screws into a bracket, and then you've got hard lines from each corner going back to the ABS unit. So those brake pipes, some of them can look real badly corroded, and the point where the level of corrosion visually is so bad that you know you need to change it, because a fracture is quite possible, especially at the high pressure that the brake system runs at. The fuel lines also start to look a bit corroded as well, especially the section that leads into the engine from the pipes that come down the length of the car from the fuel tank. So UK cars are starting to look incredibly grubby underneath. Now, when I was working at Aston, the design and development centre is Gaydon, which today is Jaguar Land Rover, but prior to that it was BL Technology, which turned into Rover. Now, that test centre has got some great facility in it. It's got, amongst other things, baths, big buildings where cars were put inside, and there was a certain salt, heat, humidity setting that these cars were bathed in for corrosion, and then they would be taken out hours, months, weeks later, whatever the test standard was, stripped down and measured for their corrosion. Now, I never ever saw an Aston go into that facility. And I remember having conversations with people at the time saying, well, it's all aluminium, there's no need to. But the steel subframe was perhaps overlooked, and brake hard lines equally overlooked. So I just didn't see the same level as testing that I'd seen on other automakers. And now with some harsh winters or harsh chemicals that are going down on the floor, and cars used over winter, we're starting to see cars that really need some rejuvenation. I wouldn't go as far as saying restoration, but they certainly need rejuvenating. So the question is, at what point do you need to look at your subframe? Because everyone knows now that it is getting a little bit of a consideration on older cars. So here's a good picture of a subframe that it's got some surface level corrosion. Now if you have a service here, often written down on the service sheets will be surface corrosion to rear subframe. But what is the point at which a comment of just a minor surface corrosion turns into something a bit more serious, and the owner gets advisory that his subframe is restored? So just moving on from visual levels of corrosion, where it's surface and not that bad. The visual level of corrosion is significantly more. The bubbling, pitting is more, but crucially the corrosion is starting to eat into the weld joints of the suspension arms and other critical components. So when you can see the weld joints being bitten into so much by corrosion, that's the point really to consider refurbishing the subframe. So here, because it is super common, as I've said, it's a good 5 cars in the workshop today which have got refurbished subframes. Then DB9, V8 Vantage Coupe, we've got a couple of subframes in stock. So these have already been zinc plated and powder coated, and we can run them on an exchange program. So if the owner has identified that the subframe has got a level of corrosion before it starts biting into those weld joints, then it's possible for us to exchange a subframe with a good one of ours that's already done. Now it's just 6 bolts to take that subframe off, and the level of rejuvenation will vary car to car. Some cars have the bolts for the wishbone arms seized in, and when those bolts are extracted they rip the bush out with them, so the car will need new suspension arms. Some cars will need the brake hard lines, maybe a handbrake caliper, maybe all the geo fixings. So there's the base subframe resto, which is just going to be the restored subframe, and then individually each car will need certain components. So it's very, very difficult to state exactly what the repair job on an individual car is, because it's going to need different things. On a car where it's been left and left, deferred and deferred and deferred, then maybe it's the owner that deferred it for many years, or it's a poor unsuspecting new owner. There comes a point where you really have to refurbish that subframe. Maybe it fails on MOT because the surface corrosion next to a critical weld joint is just so severe. Now, because the subframe has been left and it's deteriorated to such a bad state, then we can't exchange that, because when you refurbish that subframe, it really needs shot blasting to start with, taken into a fabrication shop for all the weld joints to be made good, maybe some new brackets put on. And then, because typically the rest of the subframe is so pitted elsewhere, if someone preventatively maintenance fixed their subframe and did the job early, I can't give them back an exchange subframe that has had weld joints repaired and looks pitted. So on cars that it's been left too late, they don't make it into sort of our exchange program, and they have to have their subframe corrected. Now that is going to cause increased costs, because it has to go into the fabrication shop and get remade, and also time. Now on a car where it's done on the exchange program, the old subframe comes off, new one goes in, with a few other bits and bobs as necessary that are needed. Then the duration of that car inside the workshop is probably 3 days. If we have to fix the subframe on the car, the one that's been left so long, because we can't put the subframe off that car into the exchange program, then it's going to take time to be shot blasted, time to be repaired in the fabrication shop, and then zinc plate powder coated and then fitted back to the car. So when that process is all said and done, that could be 2 or 3 weeks. And in all that time, that car is marooned on the ramp. Obviously, the subframe is out, it's got no wheels on, so it's taking up ramp time and space for a very long time. So ultimately, for all those reasons, if the rear subframe is left and left and left, the repair cost is going to be significantly higher than if it was done on the exchange program. So if you are getting a pre-purchase inspection done on a car that you're thinking about buying, then this level of surface corrosion that you can see here is sort of normal and not really a problem. And really, whoever is doing the inspection needs to focus in on weld joints and see if the corrosion is biting like it is on this example here. Base price of a subframe in the exchange program is $17.50 plus VAT. If it needs suspension, wishbone arms, a few brake pipes and stuff like that, then the job can certainly lead up to 3.5, maybe 4. Also, if the rear dampers, like those Dynamics dampers sometimes do, showing signs of leaking, it's an ideal opportunity to upgrade all 4 dampers to the Bilstein dampers, whether that's on 2012 DB9 or it is retrofitting Vantage S to the V8 cars. So the extent of the rejuvenation program really does vary car to car, because if you're adding 4 dampers, you know, that's £3,600 worth of dampers. So it's very, very minimum. Just a subframe resto, $17.50 plus VAT, something like that seems sensible. But you know, if you choose to go for a suspension upgrade as well as suspension arms, underside rejuvenation, then the cost can mount up, probably touching 10 grand after all that is said and done. Now, the subframe is classed as a Category A component, so only authorised repair centres can buy it. You know, even franchise dealers, if they were going to use it in their own garage, couldn't buy it unless they were an approved repair centre, which I think it's only Works that is. So the sale of them is restricted, and availability of them, you know, these are old parts now. So it means that really you need to maintain your subframe prior to it the corrosion biting in and leaving it to the last minute. But also the second-hand market really would be the only place to buy a subframe if you needed one. This is why some cars that have had a little bit of a shunt on the back end, maybe the wheel has been pushed inboard a bit, it's broken a wishbone arm, and the toe link arm where it goes into the rear subframe bracket has caused the subframe to be bent. I'd be really worried, really careful about checking the integrity of second-hand components. So it's much better to identify, to restore yours when it is just surface corrosion before it bites into the weld joints, and maybe a new subframe is needed, because the amount of rework on your subframe is so much that it's quite cost infeasible. But reworking subframes will be necessary because, as I say, it's just subframes on the second-hand market that are available now. And you wouldn't have thought that it should have been a concern on a car that is predominantly made from aluminium, but corrosion is now starting to be a bit of a worry. You know, you've got the wheel bearings. Now, these corrode significantly. If you look from the inside at the rear face of a wheel bearing, all the metal parts of that is starting to corrode badly. And obviously that doesn't affect the internal bearing, but on the external face, you've got the magnetic pickup for the ABS sensor. So it's super common for corrosion there to affect the ABS signal. You've then got all brake lines going back from each corner, fuel lines, Corrosion, meaning that the geometry adjusters won't remove. Obviously we've talked about corrosion to the rear subframe. Then you've got corrosion on comparts like the engine coolant radiator. You know, super common to see the bottom couple of rows of matrix on a radiator, corrosion balloon, and that ultimately leads to a fracture of the radiator. And then instead of metallic oxidization corrosion, you've got stuff like water ingress to parking modules that causes electronic glitches to the body control module, water ingress to window regulators. You've got the favourite Aston paint blistering corrosion issue, wing mirror stalks, wiper arms that need powder coating. Gearbox cooler pipes. Look at these gearbox cooler pipes off a V8 Vantage. So this is to the cooler that's in the rear bumper. On a DB9 you've got your auto trans pipes, the metal section of those. Corrosion to the engine auxiliary drive belt pulleys, making the drive belt chirp and squeal a bit. And corrosion to the inner rim section of the wheels, especially as they're aging now, and the pothole ridden roads that we are subjected to in this country. Is very common to see a cracked rim when we do a service inspection. Now that is a long list of parts to consider for corrosion on a car predominantly made out of aluminium, and a car that you wouldn't have thought you'd have had to worry about corrosion. Now all the pipe work that I just mentioned, the gearbox cooler pipes on a V8, the trans cooler pipes on a DB9, the brake hard lines. You know, if you put any other maker car on the ramp from the same era, you don't see that level of corrosion on those. You know, there was a Porsche Cayenne from 06 on the ramp not so long back, and look at the zinc plated bolts on that, and they just aren't corroded to the same level that the Aston is corroded to. So, you know, that can question whether the same level of treatments were applied by different manufacturers, and now, you know, 10 or 15 years later you're seeing the results of that cost save. But as I said at the outset, if you look at a few cars from other countries that are used in the wet, they're just not anywhere close corroded to the state that we see UK cars corroded to. Hope you like that insight into you know, how and when to service your rear subframe. Give us your comments about your experience with corrosion on your Aston. We look forward to seeing you on the next question of the week, but before you go, give us a subscribe if you're watching this and not subscribed. Click us a like, and we'll see you on next week's question of the week.